Everybody, welcome back to those who joined us last week, and welcome to anyone who is joining for the first time. Film noir is a genre. I'm sure you've all heard the term and know a little bit about what it is, but we decided during these dark winter months, what a perfect opportunity to explore some of the greatest film noir movies. And as Jeffrey said, this is number 2 of a series of 5. Last week was Double Indemnity, the great Billy Wilder movie. And all of the past film talks are on at the website. So if you missed it, please, you can go and see it there. And then Laura, of course, the film we're talking about tonight, was also done in the same year as Double Indemnity. It came out in 1944. And, it's a bit of an unusual one in terms of the series. So just to give you a little idea, some of the more traditional film noir movies are much darker than Laura is. Next week is In a Lonely Place, the great Humphrey Bogart movie. We're going to be showing Detour, and the last one is the Third Man. And you can see all this at the website. And those are much more traditional, dark, foreboding stories. Laura, of course, is more of a romantic, somewhat of a love story, though, of course, it's about falling in love with a corpse, which is sort of interesting story. And I don't know if it's really a love story at all, because it's really a story about people's obsessions with Laura, not necessarily a great love story as one usually thought about it. But this film, and it was just fantastic to watch it again this week. I probably saw it first 40 years ago, and I've seen it several times and since then. But it is very much the kind of film that you can watch many times, because it's just the dialogue, the very impressive visual schemes. I don't mean just in terms of the lighting, but the use of camera movement and close-ups and structure really is very extraordinary. And all of this, of course, was done under the direction of Otto Preminger, who is a brilliant guy who we're going to talk about a little bit later. And of course, it's all set in New York City, but obviously this entire film was shot in Hollywood and on stages. And but I think nevertheless, one of the great qualities of this film is it does evoke a certain time and place, real or not, that this film takes place in. And the way they do this and the way they create this kind of tone and place, to me, is a great feat and one of the things that really makes it special. And, of course, there is a very gruesome murder, right? Some lovely woman gets a shotgun blasted in her face. But nevertheless, like Double Indemnity, we never see the murder, right? But this was what these clever writers and directors were doing with film noir, because they were really pushing sort of the envelope in what, was violence and presenting violence in American cinema. Up until this period, of course, with the production code, it was all quite limited in terms of what they did. Needless to say, it also uses the device of the flashback, which is very pivotal to all the many film noirs, and the fact that we hear the story beginning at the end adds sort of a heightened sense of helplessness, to the proceedings, that all these characters are just doomed to play out their parts in this story. And of course, we're hearing it from the end of this story. So the suspense, of course, really doesn't come from, any particular, these aren't whodunits trying to figure out, who killed who, or that we're building up to some big event, but unlike many other film noirs, the event is revealed very early on in the process, and the suspense is really just an explanation of how and why that event occurred. Very typical of film noir films. So, again, modern day, you look at this and you might find this story and the murder plot a little simplistic or, a bit naive, but that really wasn't the point. That was not the kind of movie they were making or what they were trying to do. Again, I really believe the brilliance of this film is just in the complete control over the staging and camera movements, and of course the music, which we'll talk about, that really created this atmosphere. And in a way, it's a very simple, sort of austere narrative. The narrative itself does not have complexity, but the complexity comes from, a lot of these erotic undercurrents and this whole sense of, repressed sexuality. And Preminger was just, superb at kind of weaving those things in, of course, while the production code made, you obviously never could see two people go to bed together, certainly in an illicit affair. That was not able to be done. But nevertheless, I think we really get a very clear understanding of what's going on with these mostly dislikable characters. Now, the movie itself and how the movie got made is probably as an extraordinary story as the movie itself. And you've heard me say this about other films, but this really takes the cake. So there was a novel by a woman named Vera Caspary in 1942. She wrote this novel. It actually was originally intended to be a screenplay. She had been a screenwriter. They told her, don't write a screenplay, write a play. They tried to make it a play, then it was a novel. But nevertheless, nobody really could figure out how to make this into a movie. But it was something that Otto Preminger got very excited about. And of course, he had arrived in Hollywood, and we'll talk about his early experiences. And he was a producer working at Fox at the time. And so Fox agreed to let the movie go forward with Preminger as the producer, but he was not the initial director of the movie. There was actually another director. This was when Darryl Zanuck was running 20th Century Fox, and he was a very controlling, studio head who really decided everything, casting and who's the director. And remember, all these people were under contract, all the actors and the photographers. They had to do what he said. So the original director was Ruben Mamoulian, who was a very talented director. He did Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and many other good movies. And he was to be the director, and Preminger was the producer. But naturally, that turned out to be a disaster because they were fighting over everything. And they had started shooting the film, and Mamoulian was fired. And Preminger was promoted to the director, and they had to go back and reshoot, and even do a little bit of recasting because of the fact that, Preminger, ultimately, although his battles with Zanuck were legendary, did manage to put his own kind of authorial voice all over the project. And this became Preminger's first critical and commercial success. But one of the things we should remember is that there was a woman who wrote this original story. And there's something, I don't know what to say about it, but it does have a certain kind of proto-feminist quality that we'll talk about. And I'm curious to see if you saw moments of that in terms of how these characters are presented and in terms of the creation of this title character and the people who are obsessed with her. And of course, with these wonderful opening words, I shall never forget the weekend Laura died. That's how we start our story. So we don't have a classic femme fatale as we normally see in these film noirs. Then sort of it's a twist on that in a way. And it's really, Laura as this mystery, as someone we don't really know. All we know is that all these male characters, McPherson and Waldo, she drives them all insane, but not because of who she is, but because of each of these men's own illusionary perspective of who they think this woman is. So it's a very kind of twisted, obsessed movie, and more so than I realized in the past, perhaps, because it's done with such a delicate way. And again, with all of the visual motifs from from film noir. Some of the symmetry, the way the pacing is, it's just a perfectionist filmmaker's dream to watch this. And of course, the cinematographer, Joseph Lachelle, did win an Oscar for his work. Many were nominated, but there were some other nominations. His was the only win. And then, of course, the performers. The performers really made this special. But for those of you who don't know who Otto Preminger was, just very quickly, he was European. He was, Jewish, Ukrainian, Austrian, and he was working in Austria, late 20s, early 30s, like many of the emigres to Hollywood. And he met up with Joseph Zanuck and Joseph Schenk and Daryl Zanuck, and they decided to bring him from Austria to Hollywood. And actually, he originally started as an actor himself. So Preminger, in fact, not only started as an actor, he continued to act. And you might remember him from such great movies as The Commandant and Stalag 17. And Preminger continued his acting career. And but Preminger did come. He read this book. He thought it had some great potential, wanted to do it, and though was not allowed to direct initially. One of the big fights, of course, was about the casting, because Zanuck and everyone else were really interested in an actor named George Sanders or Laird Krieger to play Waldo Lydecker, and Preminger was absolutely obsessed with, of course, hiring, Clifton Webb, who eventually did take the role and was fabulous. Clifton Webb, just so if you don't know his work, he was a very successful silent film actor and a great stage actor, but he hadn't worked in a feature film for many years. So it was a big deal to get him and get the studio to finally agree to let him play in the part. And again, so many different things went on that, in terms of the casting and the battles, it's almost remarkable it got made. Gene Tierney and Dana Andrews were barely known at all. These were people at the very beginning of their career. And eventually, of course, though, Preminger did prevail and get everything he did want. And he did well with it, obviously, and the film is an extraordinary film. It was, Otto Preminger did get nominated for an Academy Award for directing, and although he didn't win, and then went on, of course, to make many other great films, Anatomy of the Murder, Exodus. Exodus was a very important film, 1960, because Dalton Trumbull was hired by Preminger to write the screenplay, and Trumbull was one of the blacklisted writers. So Preminger was very much part of striking a blow against the Hollywood backlist and all of those problems that had occurred. Now, I don't know what to say about Gene Tierney. Gene Tierney was not probably the greatest actress that ever existed, but she certainly left her mark in Hollywood and really had quite the most extraordinary life. She did grow up very wealthy on the East Coast. She debuted in society as a 17-year-old, and she went to Miss Porter's School for Girls and Swiss finishing schools. And, she was very much this kind of society person, and of course, well known for her extraordinary beauty. In fact, Daryl Zanuck saw her in a play called The Male Animal, which she got some very good notices and wanted to hire her right away. And then that night he saw another young lady at the Stork Club and said, no, forget the girl for the play. I want to sign that one. They both were Gene Tierney. And Gene Tierney just, and this is, again, a 17-year-old girl. So she came to Hollywood. She did play in a number of smaller parts, worked her way up to this, great part and did a great job. She was not the original choice for the movie. The original choice was Jennifer Jones, who turned it down. But she did this film for Fox. And then the year after, she did a film called Leave Her to Heaven, which was nominated for an Academy Award. And this film was a huge box office hit. It grossed over 8 million. It was 20th Century Fox's best grossing film of the entire decade. For some reason, Leave Her to Heaven is not well known. People don't watch it anymore. It's an absolutely extraordinary, very weird movie based on some Greek mythology and just, if you do want to see her performance or Gene Tierney at her best, I would very much suggest, Leave Her to Heaven. Later in her life, she was quite, chased after by all the great stars of Hollywood. In fact, John F. Kennedy, when he came out to Hollywood, in late 1940s, they had a very serious affair, Turney and John F. Kennedy, and until it became clear that his political ambitions means he could never marry her. But, you know, Kirk Douglas was another lover. They, you know, I don't know what to say. You've seen the movie, you see what she looks like, but she wasn't just acting in that movie. I mean, this is who Gene Tierney was. She was one of the classiest and most sophisticated and just kind of, you know, had that magical, charismatic quality that plays so well in the movies. Not necessarily the greatest actress, not someone with great theater training, but brought that charisma that the real movie stars of those days had. Very sadly, though, she did wind up getting sick in the German measles. She had a daughter who, you know, was very ill and suffered from that, and had great mental health issues ever since then. Wound up having 27 shock treatments. It's a long, sad story, but for poor Gene Tierney. But in her day, she was really something, as you can see from this film. Dana Andrews, of course, as Mark McPherson, you know, sort of a very solid studio contract player. He had a very strong career. Part of his problem was alcoholism. He was an alcoholic almost his whole life. He actually trained as an opera singer when he first started, if you could believe that. But many other great movies. I don't know if you might remember him from Best Years of Our Lives, which was, you know, one of the best pictures in 1950, whatever. And then also Oxbow Incident, the Henry Fonda film. So always underrated, but I think in this film was perfectly cast and really did a great job. And then, of course, in a way, the main character of this film is not Laura, it's Waldo Lydecker. He's really the main character of the film. He narrates the film, he tells us what it is. And of course, as I mentioned, there was this big battle about hiring Clifton Webb. Part of the problem also is Clifton Webb was one of the most well-known Hollywood homosexuals. And so that seemed like could potentially be an issue in this film, since of course, his relationship with Laura and there was a big part of it. But I don't know, maybe it actually worked a little. Obviously he was much older than her, you know, he was 54 years old, you know, in this film, and Laura's 24 maybe. But eventually Preminger did win, and Webb was fantastic in this film and went on to do a lot of other, he was nominated for an Oscar for supporting actor, and went on to do many other great movies. He had a series called Mr. Belvedere, which was a great series. And I don't know if you guys remember the little comic cartoon called Bullwinkle. They had Mr. Peabody and the time travel, and Mr. Peabody was based on Clifton Webb. Now, Vincent Price always shocks me in this role of Shelby, because I always think of him, as most of us do, from his great horror films and the way, you know, all the things he did later in his life. But he was a real Renaissance man. You know, he was an English major at Yale. He studied in Europe. He was well known for his expertise in art. He was an incredible art collector. He was a real fixture sort of on the Hollywood scene, wound up being one of the big art buyers. He was almost known for that as much as he was known for his acting. And he was also a singer. And in fact, in the first cut of this film, there's a sequence where Shelby sings a song and accompanies himself on the piano, because Fox was so interested to play up on the fact that, this actor had this other quality that they would use in, but of course that got caught and the singing career never happened. And then you might notice, of course, Judith Anderson as Anne Treadwell, who of course was also, you know, one of the principals in this film and having this, her own, you know, illicit affair, of course, with Shelby. And Judith Anderson, you know, was a great actress. In fact, you probably remember her from Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca. If you remember her, if you remember that great Rebecca Alfred Hitchcock film and Mrs. Danvers, but she played in a lot of great films. And one of the great stories about this film was that, you know, Zanuck was not happy. You know, obviously he was never going to be happy with Preminger's movie. And Zanuck had this idea he was going to change the whole ending of the movie. He wanted to change it, give it a new ending in which it was revealed that Lydecker kind of made up the whole thing and none of it had happened, or he would, what is up a fantastic, strange ending. And fortunately, he showed the film to a very famous columnist named Walter Winchell, who said to him, I don't get the ending, you got to change it. And having lost, this, he agreed to go back to the original ending. And that's the one we see. Now, of course, what's so amusing about that is that Lydecker was actually based on a real person, right? Alexander Woolcott, and Alexander Woolcott was this very powerful columnist in New York and Broadway, and everyone kind of knew who Lydecker was based on. It wasn't like a secret who this character was. And that added a lot of kind of fun for the audience at the time. And of course, Walter Winchell in his way was a bit of a Lydecker character as well. And so it's just interesting always to see how sometimes these reviewers really do impact how these films actually come out. And then, of course, one of the greatest and most memorable parts of the film, of course, is its score, which was done by David Raskin, who went on to do a lot of other great movies, Touch of Evil, Orson Welles, etc. And originally, the idea was there wasn't going to be a Laura theme, that the theme they were going to use was a famous Duke Ellington song called Sophisticated Lady. But they couldn't get the rights for it. And kind of at the last minute, David Raskin had to write this, like over the weekend, this theme song for the film, which became incredibly popular. And in fact, lyrics were added to it later, and it became a great standard. But as you know, having seen the film, the way this theme is, used in the film, and the motifs from the melody are, add for a lot of the atmosphere and the feeling we have. So I'd like to show you a couple of images from the movie, and we could talk a little bit about what they and why and how they enhance the film, and give some examples perhaps of how things are working. If you could show us slide 1.
Just making sure you can see the image, Fred. Is it the correct one?
Yep, I assume that we're seeing 2 images actually here.
Change that, excuse me.
Yeah, that's great. So here we have Lydecker and McPherson meeting for the first time, and of course, how extraordinary to put your lead actor naked in a bathtub, and obviously his physical qualities, and what a contrast between these two guys. And that was actually, sort of a smart kind of, I thought, part of this film, was that it also is really kind of a comment on, on a clash between, cultured upper class and the no-nonsense working class. And that was, something that a lot of, directors and movies, dealt with at this point. And you couldn't find 2 characters more different than these 2. And of course, McPherson's very no-nonsense guy, and, and cuts to the chase, says what's on his mind, though, of course, ultimately he winds up, in his obsessive a love for Laura as Lydecker had himself, So I think it's a great opening scene. I don't know if you remember, but at one point, Lydecker actually gets up out of the bathtub, and you can see, McPherson sort of checking him out. And, there's a lot of kind of very interesting subtext and tension from these 2 characters right from the very beginning. And of course, this isn't really the beginning. It's sort of the middle, right? Because later on we catch up and then we move forward. Slide 2, please. Yes, so now we're starting to, meet all the characters. Shelby, Vincent Price, again, he's so slimy and, I guess charming in a way, but I don't know what any of these women see in him, but they obviously see something. And obviously compared to Lydecker, he's a different choice, and so is McPherson, and immediately tells us something a little bit about Laura herself. And as much as, we know there's been sort of this Pygmalion relationship, we find out, between, Lydecker and Laura, that, there are other things that interest her as well. And of course, Judith Anderson as Anne, well, it seems quite apparent that, they're in the midst of their own affair that seems to be going on the same time all through the movie, and her obsessiveness with Shelby, which of course then makes her a little bit of a potential, antagonist and potentially a person who, might have murdered Laura. But, as I said, those storylines are not as well developed. But once again, they really did, the most elaborate, apartments and settings and wardrobe. And that's all, part of the fun of these movies, for the audience of that day. And then you take a guy like McPherson, Dane Andrews, and you put him in the midst of it. And he really shakes up all these characters. Slide 3. So here we are, this is again being told in flashback, and we get for the first time to see, Laura meet Lydecker, and I think Lydecker's obsession, for her becomes pretty obvious right from the beginning, and again, hard for me to call this a love story because he was in love with what he could turn Laura into, and the way he groomed her and dressed her and cut her hair, and it's all very acceptable and normal, but very strange obsessive quality, but of course ultimately that becomes the biggest problem, and ultimately what happens and why he does wind up murdering her. Next slide.
And just quickly to interject, Fred, there's a whole deleted scene from the film in which they are totally grooming Laura that they cut out of the film, which is available online.
Also, this scene is supposedly taking place at the Algonquin Hotel. And the Algonquin Hotel is a very famous hotel in New York because of the Algonquin Circle, which was this very famous group of 5, 6 of the smartest journalist literary characters in all of New York. And Alexander Woolcott was the head of the Algonquin Circle. Who else was part of that? Parker, Dorothy Parker was part of that group, etc. So, again, these are details that, looks like just a restaurant, but for the audience of the day, they knew exactly who the Algonquin Hotel was. They knew, who this character was. And I think it added some fun for everybody. Next slide. So, this is kind of a beautiful film noir shot to me. This is Lydecker outside of the apartment, right? When Laura is busy having her affair with what was that character's name again? With Jacoby, right? So Jacoby, the artist, and who's doing this painting, and they have an affair. But Lydecker had followed her, to this apartment, and clearly he's pretty upset about all this. He goes home, writes this disparaging article. What is his expression? Goose pill, dipped in venom is what he writes with. But so he's able to marginalize this lover, but clearly she's having lovers and she's looking for other lovers, and so although this helps, now Laura's going to begin to spend time with Shelby and eventually, of course, be interested in McPherson. But I thought this was just a beautiful shot, and and a very kind of critical part of the story as we start to see Lydecker and what he's really capable of. Next slide. Yeah, well, that's a pretty glamorous picture, and she was some glamorous woman. She was. They remember how they have the it girl, back in the early silent days, and she was the get girl. That's what they used to call her, because what she wanted, she got. And not, from being, a power hungry or super strong, but she just had this, ephemeral quality that just men were obsessed by in both real life and in the movies. And And it certainly worked for this character, because at the end of the day, we don't really know a whole lot about Laura. We don't really know much about her background or really have a sense of how she feels about anything. Who was she in love with? Who did she really care about? We don't know. What we know is what each of these three men projected as their dream idea of who Laura could be. Next shot. Yeah, so this is Laura and Shelby smoking. Again, they weren't allowed to show them having sex, so they would often show people smoking, as sort of a way of, giving you the sense that something had gone on and some sexual, sensual thing had occurred. And it's actually kind of sad story about Gene Tierney, because she never liked her voice. She thought she had a very high voice even when she was 17, 18. So she became a smoker, because the idea is if you smoked cigarettes, your voice would get lower. And she became a horrible cigarette smoker her entire life, which created all sorts of physical illness for her. But it was all in her effort to make her voice a little deeper. But smoking cigarettes in these movies is sort of a very, very common thing to see. And again, very interesting shot, the way the focus, the way the smoke, it has a lot of, sexual tension in it. Next slide. So, this is, of course, the great portrait. Now, interesting, Mamoulian's wife had actually painted a different portrait of Laura, but once Premanger became the director, he threw it out. And this picture is actually a photograph. It's not actually a painting. It's a photograph. You can see how realistic it is in terms of representing Gene Tierney. And it was touched over, where they sort of would, sometimes paint a little over a photograph in order to make it look like it was painted. But this is actually, it was a photograph of her that Preminger had this great idea to use an actual photograph. And here, of course, is McPherson, studying her, maybe starting to fall in love with her. Remember, he's never met this woman. All he's heard is stories. Next slide, please. But obviously, he's trying to solve this murder, but something else is going on here, right, with this guy. And look at him now, he's snooping around her apartment, thinks she's dead, looking, reading her letters, smelling her perfume. I mean, this is very, again, pretty erotic stuff for the 1940s, and a great, framing, great composition in the shot, obviously the reflection in the mirror indicating, some kind of psychological drama is happening in this guy's head, and setting up, of course, for the big moment. Next slide. Yeah, well, of course, he does come back and he falls asleep, and we don't know, and am I dreaming or what, what's happening? But we do clearly have the sense that this guy has become obsessed with and fallen in love with basically, a corpse, as this was part of their advertising for the film. And the next slide is Laura arriving home, and of course, having no idea what had happened, not dead. And for McPherson, it just, it's as mind-boggling a thing as could possibly happen, but really starts to drive him and his, obsession with her, and his obsession, of course, to catch the murderer as well, and to find out what's happened. Next slide. Yeah, so I love this image, he takes her down to question her, and, put her under the lights. And, this is such a kind of classic B-movie, film noir kind of shot. It almost doesn't have a place in this film. But again, I think Premanger's trying to, as much as he can, at least at this moment, introduce a little bit of, kind of narrative suspense, and, who did it and what's happening. And, not that this is really driving the film, but I think it has that kind of classic moment. And again, everything about it, the hats, the ties, the handkerchiefs, and I think she sort of has a wonderful look on her face, and was willing, to be shot, in a very unattractive lighting, obviously, for your female star. But, again, Preminger is really interested in the story, not just making his actress look great. Next slide. So this is, of course, Lydecker, outside of Laura's apartment. she's back. She can see that she now and McPherson have this chemistry. There's that moment when Laura turns to McPherson and calls him Mark for the first time. I don't know if you remember this moment in the film, but it really struck me. It's a very strange kind of thing because, we've never seen them, have sex. We don't know what really is going on between the two of them. But something has happened with Laura that she's, decided to turn all of her attention and charm now onto this, this kind of, this cop, this, McPherson. And I couldn't quite decipher, what's really going on here. Is she really starting to have strong feelings for him? I mean, is there a future between these two people? Or is this part of just the nature of Laura's character, that she is really attracted to these strong physical men, unlike Lydecker, and it's that physical attraction as much as any kind of emotional love that really drives her in terms of what her motivations are in the film. I'm not sure. I'd be curious to hear what other people think. What's going on with Laura's head during this whole movie. Next slide. So yeah, of course. So now he's creeping back in. And then there's all the wonderful stuff about the clock, and the two clocks, right? Because there's one clock in Lydecker's house and there's one clock in Laura's apartment. And we know very clearly that Lydecker has put it there. And of course, from the very beginning, we see McPherson walk by it in one of the very first scenes. We kind of have this idea, it's a little bit of a Hitchcockian, object that's going to have an important role, not kind of clear why. We see, we know, of course, that the murder was done with a shotgun. We see a shotgun, of course, over at the, at Laura's, cottage or summer house. But that's not the shotgun. So there's some nice intrigue about that. And ultimately, of course, McPherson does figure this out. But for Lydecker, he's planted the shotgun and now he can get it. Next slide. And there he is. And, if he can't have her, I guess nobody can. I don't know how else you describe that kind of behavior or why he does what he does here, but it's a wonderful scene. Of course, how she manages not to get killed is sort of incidental, but she does, and I don't think Lydecker is really a killer. When you think about it, as a real story, he probably would have poisoned her or something, but for the movie, this added for a nice little dramatic moment and got us to our final moment. Next slide.
We are all out of slides.
Oh, that's our, so the final moment, of course, because of course the movie wraps up very rapidly, as you know. We just sort of, the murder's prevented, one of the cops shoots Lydecker, and then, kiss and cut to the, clock, because I don't know that there is as I said, for me, it's hard for me to imagine. Thank you, Jeffrey. We could lose the slides now. What this ending could be, So anyhow, just to go on about the reception, it was considered a very successful film, very strange story, about a fascinating female and these three gents who all fall madly in love with her. The talking style of it was very interesting. Again, all this huge buildup to meet Laura Hunt. Variety's comments were all very positive, that, again, even though this sort of leisurely pace and kind of careless air, this suspense does build and build, and the situations always do appear credible. But most of the comments really were about this idea that, it's that Laura kind of weaves a spell over you, that you're not really worried about some of the improbabilities, but it's what makes this movie great is sort of this, perfection of balance between the acting and the style and the photography and of course Waldo Lydecker. He really is a great iconic character in film history. So many nominations. Of course, this was the same year, as I said, as Double Indemnity. So, Going My Way was the big winner, the Bing Crosby movie, and Leo McCarey won for Best Director. But Clifton Webb did not even win for Best Supporting Actor because it went to Barry Fitzgerald in Going My Way, who, of course, was fantastic. So the only Academy Award that they actually won was for photography. So, again, I really loved watching this. It's not kind of as classic film noir as some of the darker films we're going to be seeing soon, but I just hope you all did enjoy it and want to leave some time for some questions now about the film. And also, I'm very curious if some of you were watching it for the first time, what did it play like? Is the mystery plot so thin that it kind of wasn't that interesting? And anyhow, I'm very curious to hear if people have some comments or some of your questions or comments as well, Jeffrey.
Yeah, Fred, we have Marissa Slavin who's asking about the opening of the film, and it's about McPherson looking at all of Waldo's items first and then finally finds him writing in the bathtub. What was the setup, do you think?
I don't know. He's a cop, right? So, and he's really, as they say, our point of view, right? Everybody else are these extreme socialites, and here's sort of Mr., regular guy. So we're coming into this world, and watching, the audience is watching this film as McPherson. So using him that way, having him come into the scene, having him look through this incredible apartment is really giving the audience, I think, a chance to kind of, okay, this is the world this is going to take place in. Oh boy, this is going to be an interesting, challenge, because here's this very rough and ready kind of, detective, straight, jawed guy. And he's being introduced into this world of sophisticated, crazy, brilliant people. And how is he going to fit in? What is it going to be like? And it's very clear, early on that, none of this kind of is going to affect him. He's going to follow a straight line, and, and he's going to find the murderer and do his job. And he has this kind of wonderful calmness about him, though I love the little motif of playing with his little ball game. He has that little baseball, I remember, being a kid and having a game like that. And they were really hard to get, to get the balls all lined up into the holes at the same time. But of course, when they, it helps calm his nerves, but you never see him nervous about anything. So, but it's a nice little touch, and it's a nice little trick to throw these rich socialite folks off guard. They don't know what to make of him. They don't know people like him. So I do think the leisurely entrance, the leisurely time, again, while we're hearing the narration, from, Lydecker before we even see him, gives us a nice way to enter into this world, and Preminger sort of telling us, okay, here's how this is going to happen. This is what's going to take place. Here are your main characters. And here's this obvious juxtaposition. And I can't express enough how in 1944, this whole idea of class difference was a big deal, and as much as the modern, the large audience were not, they were middle class or lower middle class, they loved seeing movies about, the rich and famous and these socialites, and, Hollywood had been making these great movies. But they also loved it when a character representing them was introduced into that world and ultimately, solves the crime, or, is the hero, and kind of shows these people for what they are.
Cool. By the way, do you think that's a nod to Dalton Trumbo, the writing in the bathtub?
That I don't know. It could be. At that point, I don't know if Preminger, I'm sure they must have known each other. Yeah. I don't know if that was from Wolcott. I don't know. I don't think that was a Wolcott, but certainly there are other writers as well, who are famous, but certainly Dalton Trumbull, the most famous for doing all his writing in the bathtub.
For sure. Over to Deirdre Haskell, who says, I think the relationship between Lydecker and Laura is presented throughout as asexual. He's obsessed with her and wants to create her and control her without actually wanting her sexually. This is why she needs to find a sexual relationship elsewhere. Any thoughts on that one?
Well, no, I think that's very complex relationship, clearly. And and again, this was one of the reasons why, I think it was brilliant casting, by casting him older, by casting, sort of a known homosexual, though I don't think the audiences necessarily knew, but certainly, an effeminate character. And, whether they were having sex or not, I don't know. I mean, I think they probably were, to be honest with you, that's my interpretation, but absolutely that was not, what the relationship was about. It was about, Lydecker believing as the most cultured and sophisticated man in the world, he could, bring out this inner grace and beauty from this woman and make her into something spectacular and somehow, make her his, and she would always so and recognizing his superiority to everyone else, that nothing would ever be a problem. Little did he realize, of course, that physicality and sexual relationships are important and seem to have been important to Laura, and Lydecker was never going to be enough for her.
So you're saying sitting around and reading his articles and listening to his albums was not quite enough, wasn't cutting it then. Thanks for that, Deirdre.
Yeah.
Also, we have Laura who mentioned, we have a Laura here, by the way, who said that this movie was named after her. She was named after this movie, rather.
Oh, no kidding.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the song?
Well, I don't know a ton about the song. I do know, let me see if I can remember, if I have some notes about it. But because again, it was only later, incredible, again, not something that was originally in the movie, written, in a weekend, at the last minute, because they couldn't get the famous song they wanted and to use it. But the lyrics, I can't recall. But it was very famous. I mean, Frank Sinatra recorded it. It was recorded by over 40 artists. It became a very well-known song. And again, we don't hear any lyrics or anything in the movie, but it was something that certainly helped the movie continue to stay current in people's minds. There were some remakes of this movie. And of course, it's sort of funny because one of the greatest other, song romantic, motifs ever was Laura's song from Dr. Zhivago. Very different Laura, very different time and place. But for some reason, those two songs always remain in my mind, somehow related as being these wonderful, successful romantic songs that came out of movies based on a woman named Laura.
Thanks for that, Fred. And we have a question from a gentleman all the way from New York City, Mr. William McKinley. Hi, Will. To what extent has Laura been an influence on film and TV narrative since 1944? And
I think it has been an influence in much the same way that that you can say Double Indemnity was as well. I think what these films do, well, several things. First of all, just simply narrative style, narrative storytelling structure. The idea of starting a film at the end, the idea of having numerous flashbacks in a film, going back and forth in time, the idea of trying new ways to do a narrative rather than just traditional linear narrative, had a profound effect. And I can't even think of a television series or anything I see on TV, or movies these days that are just straight narratives anymore. So many of our shows, are, flashbacks and told from different perspectives and different, voices and narrations. And I think all of these guys, if you talk to, the David Finchers or even, Scorsese and the modern directors, they all watch these films. And one of the things that they definitely took away, I think, from this particular film, which brilliantly did it, and was this idea of narrative, structure and playing with narrative structure in an interesting way. And also, of course, playing with voiceover. Because voiceover is a heavily debated issue in films, and many directors, and certain directors use it a lot. Certain directors absolutely hate it because they feel like it's a crutch, that they're kind of using to just, get people through the story, and they'd rather do it with real scenes. And it's, but sometimes it's absolutely an essential way to, and works well. And I think that of all of the things that came about through this was that, of course, you know, the visual storytelling, you know, in terms of the lighting and the, you know, and the you know, atmosphere and all of that, you know, also impacted directors, you know, in the future. I think the film noir style was a very important factor. And of course, you know, the French were the first ones to kind of become obsessed about it and talk about it quite a bit. But later on, all the Americans and anyone who goes to film school looks at these movies, and it's not so much, you know, really the content, and as I said, often the stories themselves are not necessarily, you know, great complex whodunits or, you know, or powerful, you know, stories about big ideas. They're usually very character driven like this, very atmospheric like this, and I do think that they've had a big impact on people. In fact, I think it's Scorsese who talks quite about Gene Tierney's next film, Leave Her to Heaven, as one of his favorite films. And you know, and again, that fit into this whole film noir style.
Great, thanks, Fred. Ken Turner's asking about Going My Way, and it sort of taking the awards that season. Is it because the films were pushing those sexual and perhaps moral envelopes in many ways? Do you think this is why they went?
Yeah, I think, well, Going My Way was a very unique film in a way, right? But it was very heavily marketed, of course, by the Catholic Church, you know, which had, you know, pretty big audience, and Going My Way and Bing Crosby, you know, who became the biggest film star of the period, really captured a part of America that was, you know, sort of, you know, the midland of America. You know, film noir movies like this maybe perhaps were a little more attractive to folks on the East Coast and the West Coast and the urban city dwellers. But Going My Way really spoke to, you know, the great, and by the way, Going My Way is a wonderful movie. Actually, the sequel, The Bells of St. Mary's, is even a better movie with Ingrid Bergman. But they're both wonderful films and they're crowd pleasers. But the other thing that happened, of course, is the studio Paramount, who made Going My Way and also made Double Indemnity the same year, they pushed all their marketing and all their attention to Going My Way. And they knew they had this kind of hit with potential sequels and a potential broader audience. So, and in fact, for the Academy Awards, as I mentioned last week, you know, most of the Academy members worked for the studios, and Paramount would tell you what film you're supposed to vote for. You weren't, you know, I don't know if they filled in the ballot for you, but, and remember, there are only a couple of thousand people in the Academy. In fact, when I joined in the early 90s, there were only 5,000 people in the Academy. So it's not a huge number of people, but the power of the Academy Awards was equally strong then as it is now. But yeah, in fact, we were going to show The Bells of St. Mary at the Westdale. We were all set up to do a great screening in support of St. Mary's in Hamilton. Because as you know, that at one time was, you know, was the main, you know, cathedral before they built the, you know, the basilica. And I met with Father Ed, who's one of the, you know, the Monsieurs, and they are trying to restore St. Mary's. And we had a wonderful afternoon plan to show Bells of St. Mary's and talk about it at the Westdale, and we will do it again. So, but you know, for me, I don't know how you can compare those movies to the artistry and the quality of something like Bora, but that's just my taste.
See, we have a couple of lots of comments, incidentally, really amazing comments in here, far afield. And Barry Bender asks, was the entourage sequence early in the film where Mark keeps adding suspects to his entourage as he proceeds from apartment to apartment, was this criticized at all for being unrealistic, or? Yeah,
a little bit, but again, you know, I don't think people were caring about that in a way. You know, I think there was this suspension of disbelief that, and again, you know, you could really pick this movie apart, you know, on a lot of levels. And but I think, you know, it was really much more importantly was this idea of sort of the mood and the magic and the mystery and the moments. And, you know, even before seeing it again, you know, last this current week, I always remain, you know, the memories are those shots, you know, those incredible moments of him staring at the picture when she first comes in the door after we all think she's dead, and the shots, some of the very film noir shots, great Venetian blind shots, of course, but if you look at sort of even, the composition and the symmetry that he uses and the way he stages the characters, I mean, this is a fantastic director, a complete total control over a film, and you just don't really see that as much today. I mean, there are a few great directors who have that kind of, aesthetic where they're able to bring together all the various elements, wardrobe, lighting, costumes, music, acting, cinematography, into one coherent style or aesthetic. And I think that's what was accomplished here. And I think audiences were happy to kind of just go with it, but I think it's a very good question and a very valid point, this part.
Thanks, Barry. I'm going to maybe try to paraphrase. Elva Rogers has got an interesting idea here about the 3 types of masculinity that Laura encounters. And Elva asks here, in the end, really, Laura doesn't need Lydecker or Shelby. And that she loved the scene when Laura enters the apartment in white, juxtaposed against her portrait where she's dressed in black. The virgin and the alluring beauty. Any thoughts on that, Fred?
This is the essence of the film. I completely agree, is that what is going on with her? Because how aware is Laura of her manipulations of these people? And how much, even from the beginning with Lydecker, I mean, she was never in love with Lydecker, right? I mean, so is she just this cold, calculating character who's going to use these guys and then toss them to the side when she's done with them, or is she naive and and kind of believes everyone has her own best, or so self-obsessed that she's not even aware of what these, I mean, Shelby, I mean, what can she possibly see in this guy? She's talking about being engaged to him, why? He doesn't have money. I mean, he's good. Is he that good in bed? It's very hard for me to get a handle on it. I have a better handle on the guys and why they all become obsessed with Laura and what their attraction is, and why they kind of create her in their own, perception or image of what they want her to be. But I find perhaps one of the real, missing pieces, and some of the critics did criticize, in a way, Gene Tierney's performance, because they said, well, you don't really get to know her, or you don't really get a feeling of who she is. But I think that was intentional, and I think it adds to some of the allure of the film. But I don't know. I think it's a great comment and really speaks to the heart of the film. But
well, and part of the marketing was, who is Laura? What is Laura? I always thought that question of what is Laura was a really peculiar one, actually. So maybe we are transposing our ideas on who she might be. Interesting. Just a couple more, Fred, here, and we have a lot of comments, but I just see if we can capture. Did you have any examples? Marissa was asking as well about perspectives on symmetry. You mentioned, and here Marissa mentions, at the beginning there's a murder, at the end there's a murder, all with guns. Were there any other examples of symmetry throughout the film?
Well, again, for me, when I was talking about the symmetry, I was really talking about more in terms of the visual style and some of the composition and the way the blocking of the actors within a frame, and how I think there was a great frame you showed of when McPherson meets Shelby for the first time. Do you know which one that was? Slide, whatever it was, slide, and slide 2. And you also see Anne sitting below.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, so something like this, right? This is the kind of thing I mean in terms of symmetry and composition. This is like, you can almost, tell the whole story of the film right here, and so that's the kind of thing I was referring to. In terms of narrative symmetry, in terms of how the different aspects of the storyline, that's a good point. I hadn't really thought too much about it, but I'm sure it was done with the same kind of calculated plotting. One of the things that clearly works, though, is that you enter this film and it is sort of a nice and somewhat leisurely pace, and you're going through the normal stuff you would over a murder case. And it's really over time that it starts to build and the tension and the intensity of the film really does build over time. It does not start in the same place. It's almost with, cavalier voice that, that like, that was the day that Laura died. And, he's just telling you a nice story. And, so.
For me, there's an example in which when Lydecker's getting dressed and McPherson is playing with his baseball game, and Lydecker's talking about how could I, be a suspect if you look at my face and my eyes, and it goes on and on. And the whole time he's talking about himself, as he does a lot in this film. We've got McPherson not even paying attention and looking at the face that he's trying to draw him to look at. And there's a lot of that clever.
Yeah. I thought the whole thing with that clever. These are not, big plot stuff as, some great dramas do, with symmetry between characters and motivations. This is all done with a certain lightness, but ultimately it's a dark story, and the fact that he could tell this dark story without overwhelming us. And again, I know what you don't cry at the end. You don't cry when you think Laura died. There's no. And when Lydecker gets shot, oh, okay, so you know what, he deserved it. It doesn't work on that kind of emotional level that many films do, at least not for me. But nevertheless, I find it still, compelling, and kind of hypnotic in a way.
Fred Preminger's got quite a reputation as being a bit of a taskmaster in films. Did everyone get along okay in this movie? Was he?
I think so. He was a perfectionist. But remember, Gene Tierney, Dana Andrews, they were up and comers, and they would follow what he wanted to do. And of course, Clifton Webb was getting a chance of a lifetime, to have a new career. So I don't think it was so much battles with the actors. Most of his battles were with the studio, and, really insisting on having it his way and getting it made his way. And he was not a powerful producer yet. He became more in fact, this was, as I said, his first big commercial hit. But he certainly wasn't a guy who was just going to do whatever Daryl Zanuck told him to. And in fact, I don't remember if they did put a producer's name on this film or not. Zanuck really did produce a lot of these films himself. He often did put his own name as producer on the film, but he wouldn't put his name on this movie as the producer, because he knew, at the end of the day, it really was, Preminger's movie.
Brilliant. Do you have any comments, Jeanette Piegzonka? Sorry, Jeanette, I may not have got your last name correct. Do you have any comments about the remake with Robert Stack as McPherson? Have you ever seen it?
Yeah, no. I've seen it, but I don't kind of remember it, to be honest.
Why don't we take a stab at it? Sorry, Jeanette.
There was some radio play versions as well, but I don't think anybody has really, because it's such a slight story, oddly enough, right? There isn't a lot of depth or density to this story, and to remake it, well, you can't just remake it because, wow, we have this great plot, it's going to be trying to recapture all of these incredible performances and tone and atmosphere. That's not going to be so easy to do.
Great, thanks. And finally, I know we were talking before the webinar, Fred, about whether any of these relationships could, turn into something, particularly Mark's relationship. And Lindy has a thought on this. Mm-hmm. I don't know if this will convince you otherwise, but it would make sense that Laura would be attracted to Mark because she probably came from the same social level as he before she was transformed by Waldo. And perhaps this would have been comfortable for her to let down her facade.
Maybe. I just think she'd get pretty bored of him, and she's, again, Gene Tierney. The trouble is with these movie stars is, they came onto the screen with a lot of baggage, right? Everybody knew who they were. They were, fan magazines, all this kind of information. So people knew that, Gene Tierney was this socialite. She was a big deal in New York society, and she didn't need to do it. She would she had the wealthiest men in the world chasing after her, and Howard Hughes, went after her. They all did, So I don't think anyone watching this movie at the time really was thinking about, oh, this, poor girl from, middle America who just, and they kind of knew who this woman was. So the idea at the end that she's going to wind up with McPherson, I don't know how that computed, but I don't think people cared. To be honest with you, I don't think that was, oh my goodness, thank God, romance and love, prevails at the end of the film. You get the sense that she's going to continue to live in her world, and McPherson, again, why would he marry her? Because he doesn't even know who she is. He's fallen in love with this, this myth, or this, this projection he has of this woman who's untouchable, and and tells you something perhaps about McPherson and his psychology. But I don't think I don't think it was going to be a romantic happy ending like that.
If nothing at all, he'll end up with the painting in the end. So there's that.
By the painting in the movie, and that's one of the things that really pisses Lidecker off, And in fact, the painting was very famous, and it was used in a couple of other films. And I can't remember the whole story about who wound up with the painting, but needless to say, the painting became one of the most famous props in Hollywood, lore. Was Laura's painting.
Great. One final one, and we have an anonymous attendee who's asking, and it's just, I think, a way to go out and tickle our minds a bit here. Laura appears after McPherson goes to sleep. Was it supposed to be a tease to confuse us, dream or reality?
Yeah, well, yes, very much so. And there are some, as I said, even Darryl Zanuck thought, wow, wouldn't it be interesting if the whole movie, after he falls asleep, is McPherson's dream, and that none of this actually takes place, and Laura was dead. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that moment added this kind of a little bit of a sense of of mystery as to what's going on. Is this? It kind of puts you on guard a little. That what is happening? She's dead, and it's all explained, but it's a very, very smart and interesting way to introduce, again, this sense of the fantastic, or this incredible feeling of this movie being almost lighter than air. It's this concoction of people and places and time, but it doesn't really exist in any reality other than its own reality that was created here. So, but it's a great question, and I don't know, maybe that's why, again, they're much better acted movies, they're better, filmed movies, better shot movies, more interesting, cinematographer movies. But I thought this would be a good one to include, just to give you a sense of one extreme end of sort of film noir, which would be this kind of lighter romantic movie. Because next week, as you'll see, In a Lonely Place, with Humphrey Bogart's greatest performance, I think, ever. I know he won the Academy Award for African Queen, but this performance is amazing. And Gloria Graham. And of course, it's directed by the great Nicholas Ray. And if you've not heard of it, I won't be surprised, but many consider this the greatest film noir of all time. And a very interesting and complicated and dark story. So please join us next week if you can. And I also want to give you a little heads up, because we'll be announcing tomorrow and putting tickets on sale for the Westdale's big second anniversary event. And this will be on Valentine's Day, February 14th. That's when we opened 2 years ago with a big premiere of Casablanca, and everyone dressed up, and it was a wonderful big gala evening. And last year on Valentine's, we had It Happened One Night, the great Frank Capra comedy with Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert. Now, of course, this year, we unfortunately can't be at the theater. So we're going to do this all online using Zoom and technology, but we're actually going to watch the movie together, so you won't watch ahead of time. We have a way to kind of broadcast the film within our Zoom meeting, so we can make it a Valentine's event for you. And the movie is going to be The Big Sleep. And of course, The Big Sleep very much, should be in this film noir talk series, but that's why it's not included, because we're going to be showing it on that Sunday night, February 14th. And if you've not seen that movie, that really is, again, one of the great classics, not just of film noir, but of all film history. And, starring Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, and a very romantic story. Of course, they were married at the time when they made it. And the great Howard Hawks directed, and Raymond Chandler, the great Pulp Fiction writer of detective stories. And this is, the great detective Philip Marlowe, who became, there were many actors who played Philip Marlowe in different film noir movies, but this is really something special. So I hope you can join us for that. And if not, see you next week. And of course, go to the Westdale website for all the details. And I hope you continue to enjoy watching these movies. So thank you all for attending.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.
Good evening.
Thanks, Fred.